All right, everyone, I think we're live, so I'm going to kick us off. So welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Big Science Workshop. I'm really excited to have everyone here today. So first, why are we here? So as we know, there's been huge acceleration and progress in artificial intelligence. And in NLP, this has been manifesting in part due to the creation of really large models, such as language models. And while these have really advanced our field, we're kind of currently limited in the way that we can access and interact with these models. But in order to do research, we have to be able to understand, control, and experiment with the entire model training process, from designing the data set to specifying where the data is stored, for example, in data governance, creating the tools that allow people to analyze and be able to modify the data set to take care of things like privacy concerns, as well as the entire infrastructure that trains these models, the intermediary checkpoints for us to do actual analysis, and of course, along the way, like track all sorts of different statistics, such as our environmental impact. And, as a community, if we do this collectively, it allows us to have greater agency in designing the models that a lot of us ultimately are using. And so our goal in Big Science is to have a participatory collective effort to create, study, and ultimately share with the world the large language models we create, but all of the research artifacts that I just discussed that form all of these things. And so with that, I'll keep it very brief. I'm super excited to introduce Jade, who has been inspirational to me at like a personal level due to her leadership in Masakhane, which is a grassroots participatory research effort in NLP for African languages. And I have read much of her work and privileged to take a small part in Masakhane and participate there. And I'm really, really excited for her talk. So without further ado, thank you so much, Jade, for agreeing to do this talk. And please take it away.
Thank you, Angela. That was such a sweet and lovely introduction. I'm now blushing and have to continue talking. So today we're going to talk about grassroots AI, the unreasonable effectiveness of collaborative research. And in brackets, I should have added the Masakhane story, since that will be largely what we're focusing on. And so we're going to go back to the screen while I outline what we're probably going to talk about. So I think we're first going to talk about kind of grassroots movements in general. Then I'll talk a little bit about Masakhane, our successes over the past 2 years, what we're about, what problems we're trying to solve. And then I'm going to end it on kind of this checklist, which we're attempting to create, or at least a couple of the African AI research groups, who AI participatory research groups are busy working on. So without further ado, what are grassroots AI movements? And how do they differ from kind of other movements within AI or other kind of more formal research initiatives? And so kind of the goal with all these AI research movements is going to be focusing on lowering barriers to entry, focus on collaboration, on multidisciplinarity, usually either independent or multi-institutional, as opposed to like tied to a specific university or company. The goal is for it to be as inclusive as possible, as well as kind of deal with problems in a holistic manner. And I think Angela just alluded to that with kind of some of Big Science goals, is that we're not just dealing with this one particular focus part of research, which much research deals with. We're kind of trying to look at the whole pipeline. And that could be, how are people being trained? Does everyone have access to the materials in order to do their work? And so, part of this is this idea of addressing these systemic issues beyond just, the immediate model building or beyond the immediate research questions. And lastly, they're typically very community focused. And because they're very much around people and solving people's problems, this is kind of a key factor that we've noticed. And so I made this little picture, fun picture of kind of all the grassroots AI movements that I could think of, and shared it with a couple of the movements themselves and said, who should we add to this? And I've kind of got a combination here of the affinity groups from AI. So this is Black in AI, WIML-DS, Queer in AI, Latinx, as well as the more research focused, grassroots movements. And I think what's quite fun about this picture is that it actually, these type of research groups started a very long time ago. So one of the ones that I know Big Science talks about a lot is CERN, where they had this giant collaboration across a global collaboration essentially on solving these problems. Another really interesting group would be kind of the Santa Fe Institute, who are independent, and they're really focused on inclusivity and collaboration and multidisciplinarity, and that was in 1984. And the other source of inspiration I take, at least from the African context, is the philosophy of Ubuntu, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so we see like kind of pre-2018, we've got a lot of very much education focused groups focused on ensuring that people get access to like the kind of democratizing the AI space and making it more inclusive. And yeah, like largely through network building and education. And kind of after that, we see the emergence of this kind of new collaborative research group. So, you know, I think some of the early people in the space were 4.ai and MLT. Masakhane then came along somewhere in the middle of that, and ML Collective about a year later, and most recently BigScience. We've got this very like wide group, and we're seeing that this type of research is gaining a lot of momentum, which is wonderful. So today we're thinking more about kind of the research side of these, which are kind of the groups I've listed here, as opposed to the more education or network building ones. And so kind of bringing it back to what Masakhane and what problem Masakhane was trying to solve is this picture. And this picture, I saw a similar one a couple of years ago. I got the opportunity to send widening NLP. And from there, we realized that there were so few African researchers working on African languages. And they posted one of those pictures, you know, at the beginning to say, oh, look at how, you know, we've got researchers from all over the world participating. And there was still this giant gaping blank area in the middle where Africa was. And so here's a kind of more recent picture made by Andrew Keynes, which is kind of looking at the normalized paper count by country at the 2019 NLP conferences. And so we felt there was this, you know, this dual issue. It's like African languages weren't represented and African researchers also weren't represented. And that kind of points to something. And what's also quite beautiful about what we ended up forming Masakhane from is that it was stemmed off of these other grassroots groups. So widening NLP, the deep learning in Daba, all very much inspired and enabled Masakhane to exist. And even if you look at this picture, it's actually really, at some stage, I'd kind of drawn the collaboration lines or started drawing them. And I realized that, you know, there's so many people who are shared across these groups that it was actually, it was too dense, right? So, and that's a beautiful thing. We're slowly, not only do we have ourselves as our kind of collaborative groups, we then collaborate with each other and feed each other. And so many people are in more than one of these initiatives, which is just wonderful. So yeah, Masakhane is a grassroots organization. Hold on, I'm trying to move things out of the way, great. Is a grassroots organization whose mission it is to strengthen and spur NLP research in African languages for Africans by Africans. The word roughly translates to we build together in isiZulu, and the goal is to kind of have Africans shape and own technological advances towards human dignity, well-being, equity, through this kind of inclusive and open participatory research. And so I'm going to take a moment to look back at some of the successes that Masakhane has had over the past 2 years, this African NLP space, which we've spurred. And I'm going to start a little bit by looking at kind of the community's health. So as of last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago, we reached over 1,000 participants. This is the number of people just on the Slack group. We've got over 35 African countries represented. This picture isn't even up to date. I keep going to update it and then get distracted. We've got over 40 African languages, kind of built models for, over 40 publications as part of the 2 workshops that we've put together, which is pretty crazy. And then I try to think of a couple of other interesting metrics, I guess we could talk about. So we've had kind of over 5 data sets. These are, it depends on where you draw the line of where Masakhane ends and other institutions begin. So we've estimated around about 5. We've got over 10 kind of currently ongoing initiatives, either funded or voluntary. We've got around 6 part-time positions. So that we've managed to gain funding for positions within the community, largely focused around community building or research administration. We've received a number of awards, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And these ones were hard to estimate. I was just going on the ones I knew about, but we've even enabled, some people to get jobs in the NLP space through kind of connections that were built in Masakhane, as well as like a number of academic achievements, whether they be internships, whether they be, masters or PhD positions, all kind of, at least I wouldn't say we achieved that, the individuals achieved it, and Masakhane would just added as a supportory role in whatever the group could provide. More stats. We've got 32% out of 90 responses. So that's not the entire community. It's just a survey we recently did. 32% representation of women, which we'd like to increase, but still quite happy that at least we have that. We've got, a large focus of people in the STEM environment. So what we're really focusing on now is kind of people within the humanities. We do have around over 10% of people who come from the humanities, but for language, that should be a lot larger. We've got a really high diversity of languages. Everyone's very multilingual. And that's a really, dense graph over there, but that's just showing like the type of language pairs that people are speaking, which is quite fun. And this is sort of our active members. So obviously we say we've got 1,000 people on the Slack, but that's not actually what it turns out to be. But you can still see out of the people who are posting, we have between 50 and 100 kind of in the past year, which is just wild. And every time I open this graph, I cry a little, because that's such a wonderful thing to have so consistent for so long. And this is my favorite picture in the whole world, because I found a tool where you could over your, pick a Slack channel and it will extract all the emojis from it and count them. So over the past 140 days, we've had, 317 hearts and, 231 celebrations. And like, if you just look at the types of emojis that are used, you can see we're a very like wholesome, very, celebratory group. And after I posted this on the Slack, everyone was like, we haven't used this dancing penguin enough. We should start using that more. And so the next one, there might be just a ridiculous amount of dancing penguins. So apparently that's very important. To get an overview of the types of research we've worked on, or more like be able to explore it in a bit more depth, we've created this little map on Ushahidi, which is a crowdsourced place to crowdsource any sort of data on a map. So we've created this map where we've taken into account the origin of the authors and the languages and where they're from, and have kind of published it on here, and you can go explore it if you like. I'll go through a couple of our kind of high level, well, not high level, some of our major successes. So the first one being a paper in machine translation, and this was kind of our seminal paper. It served also as a position paper, which was called Participatory Research for Low-Resourced Machine Translation. And the kind of the message there is that low resourceness is about more than just data. It's a societal problem. And so to kind of tackle this, we kind of positioned, this is, one of the things we need to do is not just build models for languages, it's include the people who understand those languages as part of the pipeline, so that they can, with their experience and their knowledge, bring that to the research. And so this is kind of like one of the fundamental lessons of Masakhane. And we were delighted to have won the Wikimedia Foundation Research Award of the Year of 2021, where Jimmy Wales actually presented it to a number of Masakhanens. Which was such a great thing, because we'd actually had such a fight when we were publishing this paper to get it through. It was published at EMNLP Findings. We had very interesting dialogue with all our reviewers, I suppose, as we all do. So overall, it was wonderful to have this sort of acknowledgement. We've also now been expanding to tools, research tools at this point, where we've got kind of a translation tool and a speech tool that demo our models. Not as a means for production use, because if anything, they're there to kind of expose the failures of what kind of the societal issue we're experiencing. Another recent success, and this one's going to be published in Tackle, is named NER datasets for 10 African languages. We're now expanding this project to 30 African languages. So we're doing another 20, which is quite amazing. For us, Masakhane, it's not just a named entity recognition. Named entity recognition kind of is a proxy for me for how does your technology understand you as a human being? How does it know your names, your places, your culture? And, if you can think about anyone who's got a name that's non-Western, if you type that into your phone, chances are it's going to come up as an error. And so named entity recognition we see as kind of a fundamental cultural task that I think often gets overlooked. And then we did this really interesting paper, which was a wonderful collaboration, not only people from Masakhane, but also from Turkic Interlingua, from Hugging Face, from Facebook. Angela herself was part of the paper, and Google. And basically we went and looked at all the multilingual data sets and all of them, a number of them, and actually looked at the low resource languages. And we found that, so many of the corpora are actually just completely erroneous. And so this kind of once again further iterates of this idea of having to include people who understand the languages into this process. So we have a whole variety of ongoing initiatives. If I had more time, I'd go into them, but they're all super exciting. And if you want to learn more, you can always just join our calls. Whew. Let me slow down for a moment. Just have a lot to say. And so the next question is how? Because I get this question quite a lot. How? You've got you're not, for a long time, we didn't have any funding. And even the funding we have now is, on the data set gathering side. How did, Masakhane grow this big? How does it function? You've got no people who are full-time on the project, who are dedicated resources. The weirdest one I get quite often, it was very weird to us, is, but how do you get people to do things if you're not paying them? And I'm like, we're not getting people to do things. People do things because they want to. So it's such an interesting, it was such an interesting moment. And we're like, oh, why wouldn't, we all care about this problem. This is why we're working on it. And so let's talk a little bit about how. And so kind of from this high level, this idea of looking at the entire system, is sort of what Masakhane did. So this idea that in order for this process to work, in order for us to produce NLP models for African languages, we need to look at everyone. And we need to look at everything in terms of kind of the agents, the people who need to be there, the people who create content in those languages. We need to look at the people who annotate or translate, what their incentives are. Do they have the tools available? Kind of the data set curators, who are they? What do they need? Language technologists themselves, what do they need to do in order to get their job done? And this idea of kind of evaluation. And our argument was cool, if you're building tools for African languages, you probably need to come from Africa, because whether you're a language technologist and you're working on a language you don't understand, there are probably things you're going to miss or you're going to apply the wrong technique to. And it's also this idea of kind of looking at, there are prerequisites for each of these things to occur. A lot of say, oh, we just need to scrape the internet better. And I'm like, no, we need to fund content creators. We need to fund people to produce open source works. So it's looking at this big system. And I think that is one of the big differentiating reasons, is this idea of participatory research. So, everyone who, to ensure that everyone who should be in the room is in the room. So finding people and reaching out and building this more and more inclusive community. And then targeting funding in the right places as opposed to just more towards scraping data and building models. And so this little philosophy of Ubuntu, which I mentioned earlier, I am because we are. A person is a person through another person. Is this idea of community. It's a person of self, instead of self-identity being the self. It's this idea. It's an African philosophy of we are only as effective as we are as a group. And so there's this kind of nice tie between Ubuntu and participatory research. So this very African philosophy, which looks at the individuals who are in the research process and the respect that you give them and the kind of acknowledging their values and needs and norms. and advocating for collaboration. And so this was kind of a natural, I think, emergence, the fact that we moved towards participatory research as kind of, with this grounding in the value of Ubuntu. So now onto this checklist. Like I said, this checklist is a little bit African specific. It's a little bit low resource specific because that is kind of the state of much of AI on the African continent. But I think it can be applied in many places where there are kind of structural inequalities. So if you want to start an AI movement, or you're a part of one and looking at getting it focused, the first step we should look at is kind of direction and momentum. So step one, articulate a long-term vision. Masakhane, as I've gone through, is pretty clear. One of the things that really helped us was having an initial collaborative task. So this was something that kind of lowered the barrier to entry. It was very easy for people who weren't experts in this realm to run something and get feedback and feel like they can kind of start adding value from almost immediately. Kind of some exciting announcement event. For us, this was the Deep Learning Indaba, where we already had a large network of African machine learning people, even though there weren't that many people in the NLP space at that time. So we situated that there, and this is really key for getting the message out, but also kind of spurring that initial momentum. And then having these kind of regular scheduled catch-up meetings, they kind of maintain this momentum. Picking when this meeting occurs is a nightmare. And so we decided to center it around kind of Central African time. But that itself isn't even that inclusive, because we have researchers who have left Africa and are now studying in China, or are now living as diaspora in the US or in Australia. And so we've had to kind of move this meeting up and down around, and also acknowledge that not everyone can always be there. And so for this, like having open meeting notes was something that became really important, so that people who couldn't attend, because, whether it's because you're in a different time zone or because you've got kids and you just can't attend, we needed a way for people to be able to kind of keep up to date. And then having kind of milestones as goals, just like something for everyone to kind of focus their time on. And this is similar to any, I suppose, research group where you're kind of targeting a specific conference. And so we target a specific conference and we say, we've got this big idea and let's see if we can do it, make it this big challenge. And so that's been really helpful in kind of guiding us kind of throughout the year on these sort of tasks. And I think for Masakhane, the next aspect, and the most important aspect, is this idea of community. And I think this is where Masakhane differentiates from many other initiatives that I've come across. And it's this like deep idea of kinship, of family. We're not just there to solve the problem. We're there as human beings bringing our full selves. So I've got some fun pictures here from one of our socials where Vilimina Nokoto actually, turned on a video and said, "Look, I'm making a bunch of African dishes. Like, let me teach you how to do it." And we've also got a playlist, collaborative playlist where anyone can add songs to. Whenever we do a social event, there's always like a dance floor, a digital dance floor, because we've been distributed all this time, where someone is DJing. So it's this idea of like, we kind of beyond just this task, we have some sort of kinship and care for each other. And when we do find each other across the world, we do definitely make it a priority to try and meet up. Kind of a culture of celebration and support. So if someone gets engaged, like Masakhane throws a party, there's lots of ululating, which is the African way of congratulating such an initiative. And if someone got mentioned, published something or mentioned somewhere, everyone tends to mention it on the Slack and just like really celebrate it. This idea of acknowledgement, and I think acknowledgement runs on so many levels. For students who want to get into grad school, acknowledgement is being part of working on a paper, being acknowledged for the work that they did bring. Acknowledgement for people who are really helping with administrative roles is just kind of more like acknowledging that kind of as part of our group meetings and calling them out and giving them lots of hugs and digital hugs and support. I think that's also quite key, is being very intentional about, acknowledgement is something that's very necessary. For us, initially, this was just having a community page where all of our members were listed with their photo and what languages they cared about. Something that became really key for us was this idea of redefining authorship. So the Harvard Medical School is, for some reason, the authorship model that everyone uses. And so it's all right. I think it had good intentions. The goal was to ensure that, students were included on these papers and things like that. But it's quite limited. So it says everyone needs to write the manuscript, which is limiting it in one go, because it's already saying, cool, you have to write the method of the language of scientific instruction. It explicitly excluded coordinators and administrators, which is a bit strange because they are often key for making this research happen in the first place, and it would never happen without them. And they talk about a substantial direct intellectual contribution to the work. And I think this has been abused all over the place in its vagueness by saying what is substantial. And so you say, oh, they just added one, a couple of lines of contributed one equation. Was that substantial? And kind of the last one is it doesn't necessarily acknowledge contributing data. And I think that's strange because once again, this research would not be possible if it weren't for people who could, bring data. And so we redefine authorship in the kind of Masakhane sense as anyone who could bring a result. So they trained up a model and have some sort of result. Anyone who contributed data, anyone who helped write the code, anyone who helped evaluate the models. And this could be sort of manual evaluation. Anyone who helped with, squeaking. Anyone who helped with analysis or strategy around how we're going to write the paper, actually doing the writing itself and coordination. So kind of looking not only at research as, the people, who write the paper or the people who just ran the experiments, looking at, authorship itself quite holistically. And which is why so many of our papers have so many authors on it. And kind of the last one is this idea of having large gatherings. And, for the past 2 years, sadly, these have all been very much digital. But that said, given we're a digital community and this is, how we've existed for so long, this kind of makes sense to us. How am I doing for time? I have 2 minutes. I'll quickly go through inclusivity. So inclusivity should be straightforward, but it isn't. So I say simple and welcoming onboarding with orientation for newcomers. Onboarding is really interesting. So for us, it's joining the Slack. If you join the Slack, you're part of us. Onboarding can be a barrier to entry for many people. If they see that you start asking for level of education, they might be like, oh, I'm not educated. Clearly that's important here, so I'm not going to join. They'll leave it. I don't have a tertiary education. I'm not, this is not me. Oh, I'm not in the science field when they ask about certain questions. So trying to make that as kind of welcoming as possible is important. Platform familiarity is really important when doing anything multidisciplinary. So, for us, for a long time, we were putting our meeting notes on GitHub until we realized that, unless you're a developer, you probably don't have GitHub and you don't know, have an account or how to use it. So kind of opting for something that's more generally applicable, opting for, maybe Zoom over Discord when Zoom has become kind of a de facto standard and Discord's kind of more in the tech sphere. And it's needing there's a need to kind of have almost multiple platforms to enable inclusivity. So we, for instance, have a mailing list and a Slack and the Zoom weekly meetings. And there we seem to get a pretty wide spread of what everyone is familiar with working with. Code of conduct goes without saying. I want to add on top of having a code of conduct, we later on developed kind of a set of values. We did that collaboratively. So we created a document in one of our larger meetings, and we started working on what our values are and kind of talking about them. And then we went and circulated that for about a month in the community to see if we kind of captured kind of the key things of Masakhane. So what was really nice about that is now you can see how we can even refine our code of conduct based on the values that Masakhane has. And this idea of group mentorship or peer mentorship. So, there's no specific mentors who have this burden of being mentor. Everyone is a mentor, everyone is a mentee, everyone can learn from each other. Everyone needs feedback, even the most senior person. And so kind of for us, this is, our Slack is always loads of questions, loads of people asking for feedback, loads of people responding to that. You can see the one there has about 40 replies, which is just like this long discussion that was happening over these. And that's great to see, but I also think it's a great thing to kind of facilitate. And this idea of opportunities for idea sharing and feedback on ideas. And so for us, this is whenever anyone has an idea of they want to collaborate with Masakhane, or as part of Masakhane, a new initiative they want to do, they can come share it and start it. And lastly, open science, I think that's a given. And then, constant reflection on how to improve. Nothing, you learn every day about how to make things more inclusive. So being open to just adding and changing and self-reflecting on all the times you weren't is very useful. So this example was we required LaTeX to submit in LaTeX to one of the workshops. And then we realized, we'd only provided a template for LaTeX, I think it was. We realized that there were so many people who haven't used that before because they don't come from, the science field or specifically the computer science field. And so we then changed that to say, okay, you can submit in any format you like. Robustness, flexibility, sustainability, and scalability. These, I think, are some of the key things, right? With Masakhane, we don't want it to be a 3-month thing and then it ends. It needs to be something that continues. Otherwise, we've failed as a community. So how do we scale out? How are we robust to change? And these are very core values. So this idea of trust and ownership. And this is very much when someone says, I want to do something, or I have a good idea for something, I'll be like, yes, we should go do that. This is how you can start. What support do you need? And so we've had emergent study groups that have happened where someone is like, we need a study group. I would like to start one. I said, what do you need to start one? We're here to support you. And they've run such amazing study groups going through other people's existing materials. There's been some really fun ones where we'll do a course using someone else's materials. And then, for example, Graham Newbeck would come along and actually be there and answer questions about the lecture slides of his that we were going through. This idea of facilitating redundancy in leadership. There should be no single point of failure. The show must go on, and the best way to make sure that happens is to ensure that there are multiple people who have access to the social media, to have access to the administrative, for Slack or for Zoom, and ensuring that there's not reliant on a single person. And this is because so many of these efforts are volunteer. People don't have time to be with us all the time. And there are going to be periods, maybe even for 6 months to a year, where people can't engage because they've got other things in their life. And so this emphasis on kind of just having a little bit of engagement, come rain or shine, that Masakhane weekly meeting will happen. It'll happen. Maybe there'll only be 4 people, maybe there'll be 40 people, but this idea that there's some point of engagement that's happening. Embracing these emergent practices. When someone says, oh, maybe we could do a speaker series, that's emerged from this need for something to happen. So what do you need to do that? And this idea of flexibility. So we've kind of, instead of promoting short-term tasks and returns, it's rather we want this to benefit the community, which means often what you're trading off is kind of this efficiency of, we need to publish now we need to publish well. And I think that's very much in contrast to how the current machine learning community is working. So there's a bunch more on the checklist, which I didn't go through today. So I'm going to, you can go check that out in the links that I've provided. We'll share these slides. But I sort of want to end on this quote by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his talk, Decolonizing the Mind. In his talk, in his book, rather. And it goes as follows. He's talking here about a collaborative participatory theatre in Gorky and Nairobi, Kenya, which is where he's from. And Gorky is in one of the kind of more rural areas near Nairobi. And so this is what he says about it. Auditions and rehearsals were, for instance, were in the open. I must say this was initially forced on us by the empty space, which is the area that became the theatre. It was also part of the growing conviction that democratic participation, even in the solution of artistic problems, however slow and chaotic it at times seems, was producing results of high artistic order and was forging a communal spirit in a community of artistic workers. PhDs from the University of Nairobi, PhD from the University of the Factory and the Plantation, the PhDs from Gorky's University of the Streets. Each person's worth was judged by the scale of each person's contribution to the group effort. The open auditions and the rehearsals, with everybody seeing all the elements that went into making a whole, had the effect of demystifying the theatrical process. So I'm going to end on that as a metaphor for kind of collaborative research. Yeah, I don't think we have time for questions. So.
Thanks a lot, Jade. That was really great. It was super inspiring, and there's a lot of things to learn also for BigScience, but for everyone doing collaborative research. And I'm really happy that, as we can see on your map, there is more and more people doing this way of working together. So the question and answer session will happen on Gather Town. So it's in 1 hour and a half. So you can all check the Notion page for the event for the direct link to the Gather Town. We now have a small break of 10 minutes, and then we'll have the presentation of 3 working groups of BigScience. So the data governance working group, which has been doing already a lot of work over the summer around how you can host and what are all the issues around data governance and stewardship. The interpretability group, which we'll talk about what they have been doing around training dynamics in particular, and the evaluation working group, which span a very large scope, as you can expect. So if you want to, I invite you to go to the Notion page as well, because the live stream link for this presentation is actually different from the first live stream link here. And we'll all see you in the Gather Town for the question and answer. Thanks a lot.